On March 15, 2004, the French Parliament wrote a sentence into law that would echo for 2 decades. The statute banned the wearing of conspicuous religious symbols in public primary and secondary schools. The Islamic headscarf, the Jewish kippah, the large Christian cross, the Sikh turban, all barred from the classroom. The vote was not close. In the National Assembly, 494 deputies voted yes, only 36 opposed. The message was deliberate. The school was to be neutral ground, a space where the young citizen belonged to the Republic before belonging to any faith. Behind the law stood the Stasi Commission, appointed by President Jacques Chirac in 2003. Its 20 members interviewed teachers, principals, imams, and students across France. They documented headscarves worn under pressure, refusals to attend biology or swimming classes, disputes over gym and cafeteria. Their report warned that religious identity was hardening inside the schoolhouse and that the state had to act before the classroom fractured along faith lines. The 2004 law was their answer. Supporters called it protection, a shield for girls pressured at home, a guarantee of equality at the desk. Critics called it exclusion. In Strasbourg and Paris, protesters marched with signs reading that the law targeted Muslim families above all others. Human rights groups noted that while the wording named every religion, the visible headscarf was the symbol most present in the disputes that prompted it. The number of expulsions in the first year was small, dozens, not thousands, but the symbolic weight was enormous. A principle had been drawn as a line on the floor of every French school, and that principle had a name older than the crisis it addressed: laïcité, French secularism. The 2004 law did not invent it. It merely enforced it inside one institution, the Republic considered sacred public education. To understand why France would legislate what a 15-year-old could wear to class, you have to understand what laïcité means to the French state. It is not simply a rule about religion in government. It is treated as something closer to a national creed. To see its true origins, we must go back, not to 2004, but to 1905. The foundation was laid on December 9, 1905, when France passed the Law of Separation of the Churches and the State. In 3 concise articles, it ended centuries of entanglement between the government and the Catholic Church. The Republic would no longer recognize, fund, or subsidize any religion. Church buildings became state property, leased back to congregations. Salaries for priests, once paid from the public treasury under Napoleon's 1801 Concordat, were cut. The state stepped back. Faith became a private matter. This was not a gentle divorce. The 1905 law followed the Dreyfus Affair, decades of clashes between clerical monarchists and Republican secularists, and the fierce reforms of Jules Ferry, who had already made public schooling free, mandatory, and secular in the 1880s. When inventories of church property began in 1906, riots broke out in rural parishes. Soldiers were sent to open church doors. Pope Pius X condemned the law outright, yet it held. Out of that struggle came a word the French used with almost sacred weight: laïcité. It is poorly translated as secularism. It means more. It is the principle that the public sphere, schools, courts, government offices, belongs to citizens as citizens, stripped of religious marking. Faith is free, but it stays private. The state guarantees freedom of conscience precisely by refusing to privilege any belief. Over the 20th century, laïcité became inseparable from French identity itself, written into the 1946 and 1958 constitutions, which declare France an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic. For much of that century, laïcité was aimed at Catholic power. But France changed. Post-war labor migration from North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia brought millions of Muslim families. By the 2000s, Islam was the second largest religion in France, practiced by an estimated 5 to 6 million people. A creed forged against the church now faced a faith with different customs, different visibility, and a community often concentrated in the margins of French cities. The old principle met a new population, and when tension came, it did not stay in the realm of philosophy. It became political. In October 2020, a president would give it a name that changed everything. On October 2, 2020, President Emmanuel Macron stood in Les Mureaux, a working-class town northwest of Paris, and delivered a speech that reframed a national debate. The word he chose was separatism. More precisely, Islamist separatism. He described a conscious, organized project to build a parallel society inside France, a counter-society governed by its own rules, rejecting the laws and values of the Republic. He was careful, at least in wording, to distinguish this from Islam itself. Islam, he said, was a religion in crisis worldwide, but the enemy was a radical ideology seeking to detach French Muslims from the nation. He announced measures to come: tighter control of foreign funding for mosques, an end to the system of imams sent and paid by foreign states, stronger oversight of associations, and defense of laïcité in every public institution. Les Mureaux was chosen deliberately. It sat among the courtiers. Macron said the Republic had abandoned places where, in his words, the state's own failures had left a vacuum that radical networks filled. He admitted France had built ghettos of poverty and concentration, then acted surprised when integration failed. It was, for a French president, an unusually direct confession. The reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters welcomed a leader finally naming a problem others avoided. Critics warned that the language of separatism cast suspicion over an entire religion, that Muslim citizens would hear themselves described as a threat to national unity. Abroad, the speech drew anger across parts of the Muslim world and calls to boycott French goods. Inside France, it set the terms for legislation already being drafted, a law meant to give the state new powers against the separatism Macron had named. The speech was a turning point. The debate was no longer about a scarf in a classroom. It was about the cohesion of the nation itself. But abstractions have a way of becoming concrete through violence. 16 days after Les Mureaux, an act of terror would strike the exact institution France held most sacred, the school, and turn a political argument into a matter of life and death. On October 16, 2020, in the quiet suburb of Conflans-Sainte-Honorine, a history and geography teacher named Samuel Paty was murdered outside his school. He was 47 years old. He was beheaded on the street by an 18-year-old attacker, a Chechen refugee radicalized online. His crime, in the killer's eyes, was a lesson. Weeks earlier, in a class on freedom of expression, Paty had shown caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, including images published by the magazine Charlie Hebdo. He had warned Muslim students they could look away if they wished. But a parent, misled by a false account from his own daughter, launched an online campaign against the teacher. Videos spread. Paty's name and school were published. A local activist amplified the outrage. Within days, a stranger arrived to kill him. The murder detonated across France. 500,000 people had died in a pandemic year of fear. But this death struck a different nerve. A teacher, the very figure the Republic sends to form its future citizens, had been executed for teaching. Tens of thousands gathered in the Place de la République. Paty was awarded the Legion of Honor posthumously. Schools held a minute of silence. But behind the ceremonies, teachers spoke of a quieter fear that had been building for years, the fear of self-censorship. Surveys revealed that many teachers had already softened lessons on religion, the Holocaust, secularism or free speech, wary of complaints, confrontation, or worse. Some reported being challenged when they taught evolution or the history of the Crusades. The murder confirmed the danger was not theoretical. The classroom, France's chosen ground for forging shared values, had become a front line. If a teacher could be killed for a lesson, the state's authority in its own schools was in question. The government responded not only with tributes, but with resolve to act. The Paty murder gave decisive momentum to legislation already moving through Parliament. a sweeping law that would extend the state's reach far beyond the schoolhouse, into mosques, associations, and even the kitchen tables where children were taught at home. On August 24, 2021, France enacted the law reinforcing respect for the principles of the Republic. Everyone called it the separatism law, though the government preferred the softer title. Across dozens of articles, it extended state power deep into the fabric of civil society. Associations seeking public funding would now sign a contract of Republican commitment, pledging respect for laïcité and the values of the Republic. Break it, and subsidies could be clawed back. Prefects gained faster powers to dissolve associations deemed to incite hatred or challenge human dignity. The law tightened oversight of religious organizations, requiring mosques and their financing to be more transparent, curbing foreign funding, and forcing associations to declare large donations from abroad. It created a criminal offense of endangering public agents by spreading personal information online, a direct response to the campaign that led to Samuel Paty's death. It stiffened penalties for forced marriage, virginity certificates, and certificates of virginity issued by doctors. Perhaps the most contested provision struck at homeschooling. Where families once merely declared their intent to educate children at home, the law replaced that with a system of prior authorization. From the 2022 school year, parents needed the state's permission, granted only for specific reasons: health, disability, high-level sport, or a genuine educational project. The default assumption reversed. The school was the norm, home education the exception the state must approve. Supporters argued the law simply defended the Republic's ability to reach every child and shut down networks operating outside the law. Opponents saw an expansion of suspicion. Muslim organizations warned that the law's true weight fell on their communities, that the vague language of separatism handed authorities enormous discretion. Civil liberties groups questioned whether prior authorization for homeschooling and the Republican contracts were compatible with freedoms France claimed to protect. The Constitutional Council upheld most of the text, but trimmed some edges. The law passed, and with it came instruments the state had never wielded so broadly. Words became warrants. The question was no longer what France believed, but what it would now do with its new powers. And within months, doors across the country would begin to close. The 2021 law gave the state a hammer. Within months, it began to fall. Between 2020 and 2022, French authorities inspected more than 24,000 establishments, closing hundreds of businesses, schools, and places of worship deemed to promote separatism. Mosques became the most visible targets. In the town of Pantin, near Paris, the Grand Mosquée was shuttered for 6 months in October 2020 after sharing a video that preceded Samuel Paty's murder. In Beauvais, in Cannes-Cluse, in Gennevilliers, prayer halls closed their doors under prefectural orders, citing sermons that justified violence or rejected the values of the Republic. The Interior Ministry counted 21 mosques closed by late 2021, with more under review. Then came the associations. On December 2, 2020, the government moved to dissolve the Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en France, the CCIF, an organization that had documented complaints of anti-Muslim discrimination for over a decade. The state accused it of legitimizing extremism. The CCIF denied every charge, dissolved itself preemptively, and relocated abroad under a new name. The Council of State upheld the dissolution in September 2021. To the government, these were surgical strikes against a hidden ecosystem of radicalization. Gérald Darmanin, the Interior Minister, spoke of an enemy within and promised no tolerance. To critics, the pattern was different. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International, warned that closures based on individual sermons or social media posts risked punishing entire congregations. The CCIF's dissolution, they argued, silenced a watchdog precisely when Muslims most needed one. The numbers told a story of reach. Dozens of associations dissolved, hundreds of establishments shut, thousands inspected, but numbers could not measure trust. In neighborhoods where the mosque was also the food bank, the tutoring center, the only institution that answered when the state did not. Closure felt less like security and more like abandonment. The question hardened. Was France dismantling networks of hatred, or teaching a generation that suspicion was the price of their faith? The doors that closed were physical. The distance they created was not. And that distance had a geography. It could be mapped, street by street, in the places the Republic had already stopped reaching. France drew its own maps of exclusion. Since 2014, the government has designated 514 quartiers prioritaires de la politique de la ville, priority neighborhoods, home to roughly 5.4 million people, about 8% of the population. The single criterion for the designation is poverty. In these zones, median income falls below 60% of the national reference. That is the definition, and it explains everything that follows. In the quartiers prioritaires, the poverty rate reaches 43%, 3 times the national average. Unemployment runs near 18%, and for residents under 25, it climbs past 30%. In Seine-Saint-Denis, the department north of Paris that concentrates dozens of these zones, 1 household in 3 lives below the poverty line. Schools there report the highest teacher vacancy rates in France. Some classrooms begin the year without a permanent instructor. These are not distant villages. They sit within sight of Paris towers, minutes from wealth. The distance is not measured in kilometers, but in access to jobs, to transit, to functioning public services. A young man in Clichy-sous-Bois can see La Défense's skyscrapers from his window and know he will likely never work in them. Geography compounds identity. The quartiers prioritaires hold a high concentration of residents with immigrant backgrounds, many of North and West African descent, many Muslim. When the state names separatism as a threat and then maps its poorest citizens into isolated zones, the two maps overlap. To residents, the message blurs. Are we being helped or watched? Successive governments poured money in. Urban renewal programs demolished and rebuilt tower blocks. Billions were pledged. Yet the structural numbers barely moved. A 2018 report by former Minister Jean-Louis Borloo warned that a generation was being lost to neglect. President Macron shelved most of its recommendations. The separation the Republic feared was, in part, one it had built and then left standing, and where the state's services withdrew, one service always remained: enforcement. The police stayed, and in the space between a community that felt abandoned and officers who felt besieged, the fracture would finally break open. It began with a chase. On October 27, 2005, in Clichy-sous-Bois, 3 teenagers ran from police. 2 of them, Zaid Benna, 17, and Bouna Traoré, 15, hid in an electrical substation. They were electrocuted and died. Their deaths ignited 3 weeks of rioting across France. Cars burned by the thousands, nearly 9,000 vehicles torched, over 3,000 arrests. President Chirac declared a state of emergency, invoking a law last used during the Algerian War. The banlieues had erupted, and the country watched its own periphery in flames. The 2005 riots exposed a wound that never healed: the relationship between police and the young men of the quartiers. Studies confirmed what residents already knew. A 2017 report found that young men perceived as black or Arab were 20 times more likely to be stopped for identity checks. The controls were frequent, repetitive, humiliating. Trust eroded on both sides. Officers described neighborhoods where every intervention drew a crowd. Residents described a force that treated them as suspects by default. 18 years later, the fracture broke again. On June 27, 2023, in Nanterre, 17-year-old Nahel Merzouk was shot dead at point-blank range during a traffic stop. Unlike 2005, this time there was video. It showed an officer firing through the driver's window as the car began to move. The footage spread within hours, contradicting the initial police account. France exploded a second time. Over the following week, riots swept more than 500 towns. Authorities recorded roughly 6,000 vehicles burned, over 1,000 buildings damaged, and nearly 4,000 arrests, most of them minors, the average age just 17. The officer was charged with voluntary homicide. A police union fund raised over €1 million for his defense, deepening the sense among residents that the system protected its own. Enforcement without trust, the film's hardest lesson, had produced not order but rebellion. 2 deaths, 2 uprisings, one unresolved question of whether the Republic policed its citizens or its enemies. And as the smoke cleared in 2023, France did not pause to ask that question. It reached instead for tighter measures, a new front, sharper and more dangerous than before. The next battle was fought over a garment. In the summer of 2023, reports multiplied of students wearing the abaya, a long, loose robe, into French classrooms. To officials, it was religious dress smuggling into the secular school, a test of the 2004 line. On August 27, 2023, the new education minister, Gabriel Attal, announced a nationwide ban. The abaya, he declared, could no longer be worn in public schools. When classes resumed in September, nearly 300 girls arrived in the garment. Most agreed to change. Around 67 were sent home. The Council of State upheld the ban within weeks. France had extended laïcité from symbols to fabric, from the crucifix and headscarf to the shape of a dress. The measure fit a pattern of intensification. Surveillance expanded. The 2021 law's inspections continued. Political pressure pushed the debate rightward as the far-right Rassemblement National surged toward the 2024 elections, and mainstream parties competed to appear tougher on Islam, on immigration, on separatism. Each new restriction was defended as protection of the Republic. Each was received in the courtiers as further proof of exclusion. This is the dangerous phase. Not because France passed one law too many, but because the logic began to feed itself. The state named separatism then acted in ways that many citizens experienced as separation imposed from above. Closures, checks, bans. Measures meant to bind the nation risked splitting it further. A schoolgirl sent home for a dress. A neighborhood that sees the police, but not the services. A faith community that reads every inspection as suspicion. France faces a genuine threat. Real networks of extremism, real violence, real fracture, but the instruments chosen to fight it. Surveillance, prohibition, enforcement without trust carry their own cost. Freedom and separation are not opposites the state can simply choose between. They are bound together. A republic that defends its values by making millions of its own citizens feel like enemies does not close the fracture. It widens it. And a nation at war with itself cannot win the war it fears. That is the warning France now confronts. A republic divided cannot defend itself.